All right, good evening and welcome to our distinguished lecture with author Colson Whitehead. My name is Moira Anderson and I am a part of our public programs team here at Crystal Bridges. It's an honor to welcome you all virtually for this lecture, joining through Zoom or Facebook Live. The talk this evening is a part of our Distinguished Speaker Series, a program made possible by the generous support of our sponsor, Del Monte Foods. Thank you, Del Monte, for this support. We're thrilled to have this opportunity to bring the talk with Colson to an audience tuning in all over the country. And throughout the talk, we're going to encourage everyone here to engage with us this evening. So if you do have a question or comment, we will be collecting them using the Q&A button on Zoom, or if you're tuning in through Facebook, feel free to write them in the comment section. I also want to note that this program is being live captioned, so if you are interested in utilizing this feature, you can turn on the captions by selecting that CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So let's get to it. Colson Whitehead is an award-winning author who has established himself as one of the most versatile and innovative writers in contemporary literature. He is an educator, powerful speaker, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the New York Magazine, Harper's, and among other publications. Whitehead was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people, and he's the recipient of both the MacArthur Fellowship and a Guggenheim Fellowship. His many accolades, of course, speak for themselves, and his numerous New York Times bestselling novels are revered by many. The talk this evening will center on Colson's recent novel, The Nickel Boys, which is an exploration of life under Jim Crow, told from the perspective of two boys in one of the country's most notorious juvenile correctional institutions. This meticulously researched and searing book was an instant New York Times bestseller and recipient of numerous awards, including the 2020 Pulitzer Prize in Fiction. It was longlisted for the 2019 National Book Award, and it was nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and most recently, the Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction during the 2020 Library of Congress National Book Festival. Tonight's lecture is going to be moderated by Dr. Lisa Corrigan, Professor of Communication and Director of the Gender Studies Program at the University of Arkansas. Lisa is a feminist critical race scholar who researches and teaches in several areas, including social movement studies, the Black Power and civil rights movements, and prison studies. It's my pleasure now to welcome Lisa and Colson Whitehead. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks so much, Moira, and thank you, Colson, for being here. Thanks to Crystal Bridges for hosting us. Especially virtually on Zoom. These are strange days, but I'm happy to share this night with you. I want to talk to start about a phrase that Robin D.G. Kelley coined, freedom dreams, in his book about the radical Black imagination. And he was writing about how he got invited to do the Martin Luther King lectures at Dartmouth in 2000. And he finished the book manuscript on the day that the towers fell down in New York. And he said that he was meditating on the opportunity to talk about King's legacy and how, in his words, every radical movement failed because the basic power relations they sought to change remained pretty much intact. And yet it's precisely these alternate visions and dreams that inspire new generations to continue the struggle for change. So when I read Nickel Boys, I was thinking a lot about freedom dreams and how freedom and dreaming structure the novel. Were those two themes that you intentionally pursued because they seem to create some continuity among a lot of your work?
Yeah, I think definitely the last few books. Well, one thing, thanks so much, Moira, for the lovely introduction. And it's excited to talk to you, Lisa, and all you folks tuning in. I'm very psyched. Sorry I can't be with you guys in person for obvious reasons. My first trip to Arkansas was 2 years ago to go to the library near you guys, and had a great time. So I was looking forward. But hopefully on the other side, we'll be reunited. I had some good barbecue. I walked around, had a really nice time. So I'll see you guys on the other side. And now, speaking about freedom and animating dreams, I'm not sure why, but my last 3 books have sort of dealt with this. My book, 2 novels before Nickel Boys, was a zombie apocalypse novel. And the main character has to believe that there's a place of refuge in all the human wreckage where he can, find safety. And without that hope that there's a place of safety, there's no novel, there's no reason to go on. And in the Underground Railroad, my main character, Cora, is a slave who's never been off the plantation. And she has to believe in the North that there's that freedom, the abstraction actually exists. There's a place where she can be a human being and not an object. And without that hope that there's a place of freedom, there's no novel and really no reason for living. And, I have two main characters in Nickel Boys, Elwood and Turner. And Elwood is very much animated by this idea that there's a better world, one, and also a better world that we can make. He believes very much in the rhetoric of the civil rights movement. He's seen some advances in his own lifetime. He's 16 in 1963 in Tallahassee. There have been boycotts and sit-ins that's actually changed life for the better in Tallahassee. Brown versus the Board of Education. And so he believes that he's part of this generation that can change the social order. And really without that hope, one, there's no novel from a storytelling point of view. But also, what's really the point of continuing if you don't believe that there is this better world, despite all the evidence that things are quite terrible.
Yeah, I think too that one of the things that struck me about Nickel Boys, and it's also a theme that you deal with in some of your other work, is about literacy and about fugitive literacy, right? So I'm thinking about how Nickel Boys, Elwood in particular, he's surrounded by comics. He has those wonderful scenes about the encyclopedia. He's constantly thinking about books and how to get books or scrounge books. He's writing, right, and keeping tabs and making lists. You talk about the importance of Jet and Ebony and the crisis as Black literacy spaces. And so I'm thinking a lot about stolen literacy and fugitive literacy, both in fugitive slave, texts, but also in contemporary, moments where we think about the way in which freedom dreams circulate or don't circulate in public. Can you talk a little bit about fugitivity and literacy and their importance to the novel, to Elwood, maybe?
Yeah, well, I think definitely ever since the days of slavery, if you can read, you have power. You can liberate yourself, which is why it's illegal, in parts of the South to teach slaves how to read. If you're a master, you could be sent to jail, flogged. Definitely, if you're, a slave found reading a book, terrible things happen to you. And in a lot of slave narratives, people write about that moment when they learn how to read, and suddenly so much of the world is accessible, and you realize how much you've been denied by being enslaved, and how much you've been denied by not having access to books. So for Elwood, he's a very smart kid, early 60s, and he works in a stationery store, which has a function of allowing him to see the world. He gets Life magazine, Time magazine every week. He makes his boss order the Black newspaper, Chicago Defender, and stuff like that. And that shapes him so much. In this part, not necessarily, for me, it's like one part of the package. It's who he is, his sense of morality, the fact that he loves books, the fact that he has this attachment to Dr. King. All those forces come together to make him who he is. This very sort of unique and hopeful person.
Well, and it's interesting because King's voice is woven throughout, right? And you talk a little bit at the end of the book about how important King was. And I'm thinking about D.G. Kelly's, meditations on King and how King sort of infuses 63 in particular as a year in American public life, but certainly for Southerners and certainly for impressionable boys at the age of that Elwood and Turner would have been in 63. And so I found myself thinking about the way that you thought about writing voice, right? Elwood's voice, Turner's voice, the voices, that are muffled, the voices that are loud, the voices that are proximate, that are passing through Nickel, right? There's a lot of inflection about voice in this particular novel that speaks to the historical moment. And so could you talk a little bit about how you formed Elwood and Turner's voices and how King helped structure their perceptions of 63 and their own life experiences.
Yeah, well, where King creeps in after I had this idea for who Elwood is. I knew I wanted him to be an optimistic kid. I knew I wanted him to be sent to Nickel through no fault of his own. The same way that so many young people of color have a bad interaction with law enforcement and they can change their lives. That happens to Elwood. So he doesn't deserve to be at Nickel, although no one really deserves what they get at Nickel. You can be a juvenile delinquent, you can be an orphan, you can be a ward of the state. It's basically a warehouse for people. So not necessarily all sort of bad kids. So I knew that he'd be a smart kid. I knew that he would be optimistic. And so, I've been asked a few times, like, why did I pick Dr. King and not Malcolm X? And, if you believe that you can change the order from within, that our systems of government, our laws are functional, and if we can use them to advance our social causes, then you're really a King guy and not Malcolm X guy. And so when I create characters, I have, some ideas, and then as I try to make them real, they become more and more, fleshed out, obviously. So it's 63, that's a decision. I could have said it in 2012, could have said it in 1925, but 63 is important, like you were saying, because it's the height of the civil rights movements. The next 2 years, we get the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, but it's also the height of segregation. And so those two forces coming together drive so much of the novel, the hopefulness and hopelessness. And then once, I sort of have him allied with King, how does he know the speeches? Well, it's 63, so the technological choice is not YouTube clips, which I used when I was doing research, but vinyl. Back then, if you wanted to have your favorite stand-up comedian, a speech of someone you admire, you had it on vinyl and not like tape or cassette, stuff like that. And so, the great thing about research is that, and organizing the book, which I do before I start, is that you have a optimistic kid. Well, when is it going to be? 63. Okay. Well, whatever his influences, and then as I'm doing research, it gets more and more fleshed out. And how will King's speeches serve him? The themes of the book, which speeches speak to this person I've created, Elwood. And so, you make these choices, and by making them real and a real part of the book, they become more and more fleshed out, and King becomes a character.
Yeah, and I think there's something there too about the vinyl and the technologized voice. There's that great scene between Elwood and his grandmother fighting over, controlling the record player. And I was thinking about your archival process and about how that informed both character production and story development, right? Because this is a situated story in a specific place and time with a specific history, not just at Nickel, but also in the entire landscape of 63, from segregation now, segregation, forever, with Wallace at the beginning, and then of course Kennedy's assassination later that year. It's a big year. What was your archival research process like for the Nickel Boys?
Yeah, for me, I find primary sources, most useful. And so there are a few memoirs of survivors, men who were at the school in the 50s and 60s, 3 or 4 memoirs I read. There's a lot of journalism. I first heard of the Dozier School for Boys, the model for the Nickel Academy, because they were closed down. And then for one day, it made the national media because they were excavating a secret graveyard they'd found, as in the book. So it was a lot of great journalism, local journalism in Florida, Tampa Bay Times. So that was great. There's a writer named Ben Montgomery who covered the story for years. There are 2 survivor websites where the White House Boys, as they call themselves, would upload stories of their time there and what happened to them afterwards. Were they ruined? Were they able to make a life? And they're very short, but a lot of the language, some of the slang I use in the book comes from their first-person accounts. So that's always a great resource. And then in terms of the history of the school, the archaeologists who were digging up the bodies, they were at University of Tampa, did like a 100-page sort of autopsy of the school and the site and what they found and how did some of the kids die. And so since there weren't a lot of historical sources about Dozier in particular, having this one document by these archaeologists was very important and very useful for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a weird period because, you know, Nickel was a reformatory, and so many of the Black reformatories in the South that caged boys like Elwood and Turner were called reform schools. And it seems like a misnomer and a thing that both Elwood and Turner and a lot of the other boys who are, you know, characters in the book are really meditating on the notion of reform and who needs to be reformed and why they're there.
Well, you know, I think, you know, the idea is a really good one. You know, instead of having these teenage delinquents locked up with adult predators, want to have a separate thing where they can, separate place, they can have schooling and learn a trade. But, you know, as soon as you get humans involved, things go bad pretty quickly. And there was not much reforming going on.
No, a lot of trauma, though. It's a book, I think, deeply steeped in trauma.
That's the story of the place. You know, I think, you know, 2/3 of the book takes place in the 60s and 1/3 takes place in the decades after, as Elwood tries to find his place in the world. And I'm not trying to exploit what happened, but that's the sort of baseline of Elwood and Turner's experiences. And, you know, part of the book is about what happens there, and then part of the book is about overcoming trauma, making a coherent self. Which of the kids can find their way in life, which of them don't? What is it that makes this kid able to transcend this year and a half that put him off the track of life, and what dooms another kid to alcoholism or drug use or a life of crime? How do they find the capacity to love, to be loved? And so there's a lot of trauma, and also, you know, part of the work is narrating the path out, who gets out and why.
And a lot of, I think, internal conversation and some of the dialogue about chance, right? And it's not all intentional. You can't just will your way out of Nickel, right? You have that great, it's like there are 4 ways to escape, right? I mean, you can't just will your way out of a situation like Nickel.
No, there's the bad luck of your family circumstance, you know, the bad luck of Elwood, who again is a stand-in for so many, you know, kids who are in the wrong place at the wrong time. If Elwood had left the house 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later, he wouldn't have hitchhiked with the wrong car. But it's that one moment of chance that sets his whole life on a different path. And so many of us have those different moments in our lives that, you know, things can go different way, we would have been set down on a different path.
How do you feel about Elwood now, after the book is out and you've been talking about him for so long? Does your relationship with him as a character change when he's out of your head and onto the page, and then he becomes part of your public conversation about Nickel and your writing process and contemporary politics and all the rest of it?
Well, it helps. I like him. I like Turner. You know, sometimes when you write a book, you're done and you're really done with it and don't want to talk about it. It's like, totally. You know, but I've been fortunate the last few books I've really enjoyed writing, and I felt they've been very important to me, just as my growth as a person and a writer. And so Elwood's a part of that. You know, some people ask, am I more Turner or Elwood? I'm definitely, actually I haven't revisited it since the election, but you know, we're living in Turner times. You know, why there's so much evidence that the world is going awry and so little evidence that we're going to get together. So why should we believe, like Elwood, that there's a reason to be hopeful? Shouldn't we all just be Turner? So I've been Turner, but I have to say the last couple of days, a little bit better. So, you know, and what those 2 kids represent is, of course, part of my way of seeing the world. You know, do I want to believe that the world's going in a positive direction, or do I not want to? And so their, you know, their core broad stroke descriptions, I think, you know, speak to a lot of us.
Yeah, and I think also there's ambivalence in the novel, right? I mean, within Elwood, within Turner, you know, within the narrator's voice about the events at Nickel, there's a lot of ambivalence where two things are true at the same time, or two feelings are being held at the same time, even though they're in opposition. And that seems like a useful thing to explore always about, you know, anti-Blackness and Black public life, but also particularly in this historical moment that we are living in.
Well, I mean, I think what does it mean that so many people turned out, you know, this summer for protests against police brutality, and then so many people voted for the police brutality candidate, more people than they did before. What do those two things mean? Uh, uh, it's a big country and there's definitely a space for a lot of us. And so as I sit here in my New York Upper West Side bubble, which I think my zip code gave the most money to like Biden, to other places that are exactly, you know, the inverse, and both of us make up this, you know, this country right now.
But space and place are real. You know, there is a sense that Elwood and Turner and all the boys in Nickel are a product of a particular geography in Florida, in that case, right? How do you feel like the geography of Florida helps us understand Elwood and Turner and Nickel as an institution at all?
I think they are Florida kids, but for me, it's really just about race and poverty. And you know, the same way I could have said it in 45 or 2012, I could have said it in any different place across the country. I put it in Florida just because that's where the real Dozier was. But it is a novel; it's not a nonfiction piece, and I could have put it anywhere. But I wanted to honor this, you know, the men who were actually there. So you know, the Black kids got it bad, but the white kids got it bad too. And it's just a simple fact that we don't care about poor kids of any color. And when the powerful have a chance to take advantage of the powerless, they will. And so, you know, writing about Tallahassee and sort of doing Florida was a nice challenge. And get out of my New York head. But definitely, you know, I see them more as just, you know, unfortunate children.
Yeah, I think for me, as somebody who writes about prison like a lot, thinking about the Southern reform schools and their history on the plantations was really important. As for me, coming from Arkansas, because we had one of these reform schools here too in Wrightsville, we had two separate spaces for it. And it was a really horrible place. It was originally called the Arkansas Negro Industrial School in Wrightsville. And there was a horrible fire in 1959. All of the boys were locked inside, and 21 of them died. They were set on fire and locked inside. And so it's a pretty horrible moment in Arkansas history in '59, but it's really like an essentially Southern story that's repeated not just at Dozier, but in all of these other social locations, especially in the South. So yes, I hear you talking about them being, you know, any boys at 16 and 63, but in some ways it feels very Southern to me. So even though you were getting out of your New York head, there are parts of it that are, I think, that resonate for me in Arkansas, and I suspect for many of the folks who are tuning in with us now about, you know, just thinking through the Southernness of it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, for my part, writing the book and I'm talking to different people in different places in the South and the North, but also other countries. A lot of people can claim those are like places, you know, nickel type places. When I was in Canada, people would say, "Oh, this reminds me of residential schools." Sorry, where they took Indigenous children from their families, and the same sort of to teach them white culture, and the same sort of abuses happened. In Australia, there were same sort of schools. In Ireland, homes for unwed mothers, where the same sort of stories would come out. And so, you know, it really is anywhere where there's a culture of impunity. If you can get away with it, you do, unfortunately, sometimes, and people will look the other way.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a Bildungsroman, right? It's about boyhood. Why boys?
Just that's what the model was. I mean, I've Sag Harbor, my book about growing up in the 80s, is about teenagers, and Cora is a teenager, and a lot of her, when I narrate her journey into becoming a person, not a slave, an object, there is that, that journey. So I've written a lot about teenagers. I hate being a teenager, and I should probably examine it, but they provide important moments of drama.
Yeah, and clarification and clarity and grappling, and especially about these big ideas about freedom for sure, and movement, and how we participate in culture and protest and education. I think, as a college professor, it's cool to me that Elwood's like, but I'm going to college, right? He's like, do these people not understand? Like, I read all the time and I'm prepared to go to college and I'm doing all this stuff. And then it's just this split moment, right? When he's off that track and into nickel.
Well, actually, it's his choice to go to college classes that gets him into this trouble.
Yes, it is. He gets punished for knowing too much, uppity, for being uppity, really, for having these skill sets that are not transferable to all people at all the time. What do you think about the relationship between Elwood and Turner as it moves across the book, as they orbit each other?
Well, I mean, I came with Elwood first, but when you have a character that's sort of that strong, has, so identifiable in his characteristics, it does immediately call out for his opposite. And so Turner came, pretty quickly. And of course they define each other, reflect each other, and Elwood's philosophy, Turner's philosophy, there's no sort of one way of moving out in the world. I think most of us, pick from both ways of being hopeful, being realistic, and trying to find a way in the middle that allows us to, survive every day. And so, they definitely define each other. And then part of, for me, the book really starts once they get together, they're in the hospital, mm-hmm. and their sort of philosophy, their discussion about how to be really becomes the heart of the book. How do we live, basically?
Yeah. Well, especially in nickel, how do you do it in an adversarial environment where you need to collaborate, but also need you need to be far away from collaboration? That's a tight, tight needle to thread.
Yes, I mean, and definitely all the boys are there trying to figure it out.
Yeah, and it seems too like mobility is a theme in the book about how people move and where they move, where they can move freely, where they are constrained in their movement, who they move with, and when they move, and what time of day, and if they hear other people moving at night, especially when they're taken and when they're confiscated at night. I guess I can't help but think about the physical movement of the boys in and around Nickel, and then the political movement of, mass Black politics in '63, having a relationship with each other, the boys who are trying to figure out how to navigate the world and how to occupy the spaces that they are permitted to and not permitted to occupy, and the way that that's happening on the outside as Elwood gets little bits and drabs of information about King and, mass politics.
Well, he's, the way the book's constructed, he's the only person who sort of knows what's going on, who sort of has political consciousness. And that's his burden. On the outside, it's one thing to have all these ideas of how to be and how you're going to change the world. And they're very abstract, and it's fun to march in front of the movie theater, as he does in Tallahassee before he goes to Nickel. But once he gets inside, all those great ideas are put to the test. Can you actually live like Dr. King? Can you actually have these ideas of nonviolence, struggle, and love for your enemy? You can have them in the abstract, but what does it mean that when you actually have to put them, to use? And so, definitely the way the book is constructed, he becomes the carrier, Elwood, of all that sort of terrible knowledge.
Yeah, I think too, it's interesting in thinking through how both Elwood and Turner navigate white people, men, boys, people on the inside of Nickel and on the outside of Nickel, it sort of feels to me like the Matrix, right? Like Agent Smith, like all of the white people are just sort of this blur that pop up here and there, but they're all sort of reproducing the same sort of social violence in just like minor tweaks. Like this one likes the paddle, this one likes the whip, but you know, basically we will take the whip over the paddle. So I mean, whiteness in the minimal spaces that it occupies in the book, I think is useful in creating contrast for both Elwood and for Turner as they navigate Nickel and the landscape surrounding it.
Well, I've been doing you know, some classroom visits with high school kids. You know, I'm really you know, lucky that, unfortunate that people are teaching this book in college and high school. And so, and definitely this fall, I've gotten the question, like, Harper is a guard at the school and seems to be a friend of Elwood Turner and ends up turning on him. And I feel like high school students always want to know why something's in the book, why something's happening. College kids want to know if their interpretation is right. And then, you know, creative writing grad students just want to know how to get an agent. But definitely the high school kids, high school kids want to know why. And I'll just say, you know, why do you think? And what, so they want to know why Harper turns on them.
Yeah.
And I'm like, why do you think? And they know the answer, because not every ally is an ally. And you can be part of the system and enjoy your privilege and take advantage of it when you know, when it's worth your while. And so, you know, there's his boss at the stationery store, there's Spencer, there's Harper. It's not a huge white cast.
No.
And, you know, I'm definitely trying to find different ways that I can test Elwood and Turner by deploying, you know, the white supporting cast.
Yeah, it's the way that they sort of learn how to structure their decision making, as well as their ethics and sort of the way that they navigate the new relationships that they're forced to build at Nickel. I'm really interested in intimacy, and so there is some intimacy in this book. You know, it's intimacy among and between boys, especially, but also the intimacy of violence. And so, can you talk a little bit about closeness? How the boys get close and they stay far away, how they flirt with intimacy and divulging parts of themselves, what they wish to share, what they don't wish to share, when they feel comfortable, when they don't, about intimacy, and how intimacy is part of the big question of being a teenager, but also it's a big question of social violence.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, if you read the book, you sort of know the moments where the boys are just, you know, displaying, you know, great love for each other and sharing of themselves and disclosing secrets, and also withholding. You know, I'm not going to, you know, Turner's like, I'm not going to say this to Elwood, or, you know, I'm going to save this, you know, for a different time. And so, you know, there's a great love between the boys, which, you know, is great to narrate. And like as you're saying, there's an intimacy of violence. Again, I was not trying to exploit it, but it has to sort of be in there.
Yeah, yeah.
But it does bind them. It binds the kids in the secret. You know, if you've been taken to the White House, you now share this thing. You now know what happens there and what, you know, and how it changes you. So it's bonding, but also, you know, later on in a novel where, you know, the older Elwood is married. How can he share of himself in an adult, grown-up way what's happened to him, his past? And so there's that, you know, I think you have to love yourself first before you can share that, before he can actually, you know, talk about his wife, about who he is and where he's come from. He first has to sort of forgive himself. And so there are others, I mean, you're right, there's always different kinds of romantic relationships. And again, without them, how do you survive a place like Nickel? How do you survive being in the world?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the Q&A in the sidebar is about hope and optimism and how to keep it. So how do you stay optimistic as you write these kinds of books in this kind of political moment that is always the political moment in America? It's not like this moment is so drastically different from 63 or 54 or 45 or 32, right? Or 89.
I don't keep optimistic. I'm very pessimistic, and
I'm with you.
And you know, terrible people get away with terrible things, both both in Underground Railroad and Nickel Boys. Slavery ends, the school closes, no one's held accountable, no one goes to jail for the abuse, the rapes, the torture. They live long, happy lives, the slave masters, the guards. And so part of what made me write the book was outrage at the powerful never being held to account, and the powerless, the innocent, suffering. And when I was taking notes for the book, and whenever I write something down on my phone in the middle of the night, the top of the file, were those two sentences. And the book starts with, my notes to myself are the powerful never held to account, and the innocent suffer. And that's the story of Nickel. But how do we escape that? And that's where hope and optimism comes in. So I think for the first time, I got bummed out writing a book. The last 6 weeks of writing the Nickel Boys, I was bringing Elwood and Turner to their conclusion that I'd mapped out 2 years before. I was getting more and more depressed as I got closer to the end. I felt really close to the men whose stories I'd read. I didn't want to it's not nonfiction, but I didn't want to let them down. I was hoping to capture at least some of their truth in the book. And so how did I keep my optimism? I finished the book, and then I spent 6 weeks playing video games and barbecuing and grilling and smoking meat. And so I turned off my head and just cooked for my family and played video games. So that was my coping mechanism, to decompress.
I mean, I think you have to after this. And also, I mean, as you were saying about the fidelity that you had to their stories and the responsibility you had to represent their life experiences. I mean, it's a burden. Fiction is a burden. I think that a lot of people who aren't writers are just like, oh, well, that's playful and you're playing in ideas, and it's all pleasure all the time. You're not doing, I don't know, deep research. I think people have these odd ideas about how writing happens, but there's no writing that doesn't happen that doesn't leave part of yourself on the floor, right? Or in the novel, as the case may be. So it makes sense that there's decompression after this one, for sure.
Well, it is work. It's a job.
Yeah.
there are worse jobs.
Sure.
But yes, obviously it's a job.
Another day in the mines, is that what you're saying? Yeah, totally. It's funny, when I thought about preparing this, I almost picked out 10 different quotes from the book that I thought structured a bunch of the ideas within it, because that's how I wrote my notes when I read through this one for the first time. And one of the ones that struck me was, look at what they did to me. Look at what they did to me, which you repeat twice. There are very few places in this book where you repeat yourself more than once, right? But that one you repeat twice. Look at what they did to me. I like that because I think it gives us a sense of structural, discrimination, segregation, violence, right? Where it's a thing that happens from a system to an individual. And that seems to be part of the way that Elwood and Turner are starting to understand the way that they're situated inside of Nickel, but also in the larger worlds in which they inhabit.
Well, in that scene, he's in the hospital, he's getting out of the hospital and wants to tell his grandmother what happened to him, and he can't. And so, we're talking about disclosing and giving of yourself to other people and intimacy. And obviously, this trouble things happened to him, but he's part of a new brotherhood. The boys at Nickel, he's part of their tribe now. And he's sort of in exile from, the real world outside. And that's at that moment him sort of realizing that he can't share this new knowledge.
No, and you repeat the term snatch, getting snatched and snatching back as also part of that, agency where you get sucked in, right? It's a wave, right? Where an undertow that you get sucked in, or you get snatched or grabbed, or you get kidnapped. All of these things that are happening to these kids at a super formative part of their life that they really cannot, they have no agency to stop. They can only adjust, right? As it's happening or after it's already happening. There's a way in which, they are fluid as teenagers in a way that adults are not. And so you see them responding to these things that are literally happening to them, whether it's violence or whether it's, being stripped away, or whether they're encounters with their family, or whether they're putting up Christmas decorations. Some of those Christmas conversations are fascinating as like sites of nostalgia and also labor, the way that these boys are moving their bodies, taking up space, producing goods for white states, and things are being done to them.
Well, I think, in figuring out what I could use from the real place for the novel, I was trying to find, different sites like arenas. And so there's a ham radio club, there's a football team, there's a pool. In the end, I went for the boxing team. The boxing team seems to have more drama and lays bare some of the more elemental drama. And then the Christmas pageants. I never went to Dozier. I got really, I was writing, and the more I got further into the book, the more I felt sort of panicky and upset about going there. But there's like a century of photographs because it was well covered in local papers. And one of the things that was really well covered was the annual Christmas pageant. And people would come from all around, miles and miles to see, this work that the kids did. They work on it for 6 weeks with these tracks, and seeing them, these kids in the 50s making these, great, dioramas. They're really happy. But then you'll sort of, you can also see the kind of darkness at the edges of the photograph. And so, there are real life places like the Christmas festival, which is real, but the boxing team, wasn't as elemental as, the black kids didn't fight the white kids. So I made that, change after the book. But as because I had the liberty as a fiction writer, I could find different, places in the story of Dozier that made me think, oh, what about this? What about this? Maybe this thing will serve Elwood's story. Maybe this will serve Turner. And there you have it. So.
Well, I mean, you've written so much, right? And we have a short amount of time, but a lot of the folks in the chat are thinking about The Intuitionist. It's been 20 years since you wrote that book. And how would you say that your treatment of race in that novel compares with Nickel Boys? Would you say that the way that you are writing about race has changed over the last 20 years? Has it become more attuned to certain valences of the way that, whiteness is shaped now and the way that you're writing about it in the novel, or blackness or anti-blackness? Or, would you say that the contours of the way that you write about it have changed?
I think it's just really the subject demanding how it's told. And so the Intuitionist deals with race in one way. The Colossus of New York has nothing to do with race. It's about New York City.
Totally.
And is the Rush Hour chapter about Black Rush Hour or White Rush Hour? It's about Rush Hour. I think there's a detective novel, sort of postmodern detective novel structure to The Intuitionist. And I just finished a book that, coming out next year, that's a crime novel where I played straight. There's no sort of shenanigans. There's no sort of playing with form. It's really straightforward. And so writing a crime novel straight, writing a crime novel from the side, writing about race as an allegory, writing about race directly as in Nickel Boys. There are all those different ways, different tools that I all seen as valid. I think in terms of 20 years, I think I'm a better writer. I think I write a better sentence. Definitely The Intuitionist could do some adjectives. Maybe it's just me, but hopefully you do something for a long time and you get better at it. So definitely, I think the way that Elwood and Turner and Cora up here on the page, I could have done, 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's funny about adjectives. That's a writer thing. It's just totally is. Can you talk a little bit about magical realism and how you find it useful to convey, the complexities of human challenges from, especially around agency from object to subject?
Well, there's no fantastic element in Nickel Boys. So like I was saying, use the right tool for the job. And so with Underground Railroad, I had this idea to make the metaphor into a real train. And so from its conception, there's a fantastic element. And so it's going to be sort of broadly fantastic, like science fiction-y. Is going to be more muted, like the way it turned out with magical realism. I was trying to figure out, and rereading 100 Years of Solitude before I started writing was very instructive, because I sort of knew I wanted the fantastic things to be sort of deadpan. And I was rereading Garcia Marquez, and he talked about how he came up with this form of magic realism. Was from his grandmother, who would tell stories about the village, and she would mix in the real and the fake, but tell it with a brick face. So you never knew like what was real and what was not real. And that's how fantasy works in Hundreds of Solitude, and definitely there are all sorts of crazy, horrific things that are fantastic or terrible happening to Cora, sure. And the narrator tells with a straight face. And so that's one way of doing fantasy. I think Zone 1 before Underground is a zombie book, and zombies are pretty fantastic creatures, and they're very much in the fantasy parts of that book are dealt with differently than fantasy and Underground Railroad. So before I start writing, I was like, who's the narrator? Is it first person, third person? Is it realistic? Is it fantastic? What's the best way to tell the story? And I'm going through all that before I start, so I don't get to page 200 and like, wow, I really screwed up. So the more things I plan out before, the better things seem to go.
Well, you told me before we started that you have a new book on tap that we might get to see next year. Could you give us a teaser about it?
Yeah, it's I had the idea. I haven't really talked about it yet, so I'm gearing up to talk about it. But it's a crime novel set in Harlem in the 60s. I think where I wrote a bunch of books that took place in contemporary America, the John Henry days, Zone 1. My last 3 books have been historical, I think, because I sort of said my piece. I don't have much to say about how we live now. And I've been finding more research in slavery or Jim Crow or New York in the 60s, where I don't feel like I'm repeating myself. So it's a crime novel, takes place uptown, 1960s. My 3 inspirations were Richard Stark, Chester Himes, and Patricia Highsmith. Right. I was reading all these detective novels. I was like, actually, I don't care about detectives. I care about sociopaths. And so Richard
care about sociopaths. It's a good sentence. It's a good sentence. I don't know if it's true, but it's a good sentence.
And so, yeah, so in the criminal set, and it was cool doing research. I was walking around. I haven't lived uptown in a long time, and so I was trying to find places for my guy to live, and his office, and his home life, and where he grew up. And I would do research about the Hotel Teresa, which was like the Black Waldorf. And I would tell my mother, oh yeah, I was researching Hotel Teresa, the chock full nut. She's like, oh yeah, I ate there all the time. We're basically writing about the period where my mom and dad were like young 20-somethings in New York. Mm-hmm, totally. And I was like, oh, Blumstein's was his department store. My mom's like, oh yeah, your dad worked there like 3 summers. And so I should just be talking to her instead of like going to Google and stuff like that. So it's been cool to sort of see, like what the city was like before I came on the scene. It takes place in the late 50s, early 60s, and it's been very, very fun to research.
Oh, that's great. I think we're all looking forward to seeing it. I think we're rolling up on the time where I'm going to turn to the Q&A from the audience that I have here in the chat. So one question is about the future of America and how you feel. I mean, it's a very interesting moment to think about futures, right? Like this exact day. And one of the listeners wants to know how you feel about the future of America. What makes you optimistic about America? And I think that that's probably useful in thinking about the optimism of Elwood, certainly about how to maintain the optimism and the freedom dreams and the movement and the motion.
Well, I mean, there are a few things. I mean, even if like across the world, we have a lot of like right-wing governments and ascendants in Europe and South America here. And so even if those people are voted out of office, they're still, say, global warming. We were talking before, you said it was 75 degrees. It was 75 degrees here 2 days ago. It's not supposed to be 75 degrees in New York in November. So We have a lot of long-term things like global warming and climate change to work on, which make, looking to the future, very sort of hard. I have children, and I have to hope that 60 years from now, the world will be better, the same way that my grandparents, with very little evidence, had to believe that my generation would have it better, and we do. My parents, same thing. And and talking to the teenagers in these various high school visits, the questions are great. They're very politically committed. They're asking really important questions about race and identity and homophobia and like their community and what they can do. So I think, the silent generation, baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, we screwed everything up. But I think there were some really great teenagers out there, and maybe they'll pick things up where we failed. So
that's fair. I hope that that's true. I hope my kid can do it. I'm trying to make sure. We're all lost, I think, at this point. I have a question here about justice. There's a line in the book that I think is about the handbook at Nickel that says, like justice, it existed in theory. And so
sure.
There are a couple questions here that are about justice and how we should understand justice. And in my mind, I think about it as a process, not a product. But, there's a lot of justice meditation in this book. And so a lot of these questions speak to it.
Well, I mean, bad people get away with doing bad things. They're not held to account, whether it's a policeman kills an unarmed person and shoots him 10 times in the back, or a slave master or a guard at a reform school. A lot of people get away with terrible things. And you would say that justice is not being meted out. I think about the protests this summer. What kind of laws will we put into effect? What kind of reforms? Anything we come up with can be undone. Voting Rights Act, 65, great. And then, 40 years later, it can be dismantled by a malevolent Supreme Court administration. So if we're going to have any kind of justice, we have to be vigilant. It's just so precious because, we can be pretty troubled people sometimes. And so I would put justice in the same sort of pile as hope. You have to believe in it, or else what's the point? Though it's very difficult. It's very difficult a lot of the time.
I totally agree. Folks want to know if you've had any reactions from Dozier men, either who have read the Nickel Boys, who've heard about it, and if so, what were their reactions?
Sure, all positive. I mean, everyone I've talked to said they liked the book, so I hope they were being honest. I did a few events, like radio events, interviews with some on the road. Sometimes people came and talked about them being at Dozier, or like their brother or sister being at Dozier. And so, it did approach some of their truth. So I was very glad. Oddly, the first person I talked to who's at Dozier lived like 4 blocks from my house in Manhattan. And he, like Elwood, was there in the 60s, came north and moved to the West 80s off Broadway, exactly where Elwood moved. So I was like freaking out. And then we met, and he's the first person I met. And he said, it was the best place I've ever been. It was like, taught me discipline, taught me a skill. He was like, there's no homosexuality. I went to the White House, and then that's when it sort of changed, because he would describe going to the White House, and you could just see his whole body tense up in his face, and he was reliving it. He was gripping the air like this, as if gripping like the bed springs, the bed frame, and you just see it how close it was, even though he was denying repeatedly so much that it seemed like a protestation. How bad it was. It was still living within him, 50 years later. So, and he said, I got some things right, some things I got wrong, not wrong, but there were changes, like the boxing matches. They were so segregated that didn't happen. I got out of that meeting, and I was just like, I did read all this research, right? Like I feel like I'm totally going crazy. And then, he's the only person who sort of refuted what hundreds of survivors have said, and obviously it's about his psychology and who he was and stuff like that. But so I've been glad that the book approaches some of the truth of what they went through.
Yeah. Oh, it's like being inside a Fanon, right, book, thinking about the psychology of that trauma and what we can still speak and not. I mean, that's a living example of the way that.
Yeah, I mean, and definitely with Underground in this book, I have been trying to, dramatize trauma and how we escape and how it stays with us. And so, the more that we, part of my job is to put myself in these people's shoes, and how does being on a plantation, how does Jim Crow, how does being in a place like Nickel deform your sense of self, and what are your survival tactics? That's definitely, part of that is, in Eldon Turner and some of the other kids in the book.
Yeah. We have one question here about what it's like to talk to high school kids about your book. And the person asks, with an award-winning book like this, do you hope that we'll eventually enter into school programs alongside books that are classics like To Kill a Mockingbird? They're serious but fiction and show a lot of the past of our history as Americans.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that both Underground and Nickel Boys has it's found its way in different kinds of syllabi. And I've been going to schools for 20 years now, mostly grad students and college kids, and not high school as much, but definitely Nickel Boys is getting a lot of high school adoptions. And so it's great to see them sort of wrestle with these things, sometimes for the first time. Definitely, like, there are a lot, slavery is taught so poorly, I think better now than, say, 30 years ago. But what, is the link between scientific racism in 19th century America and Nazis in Germany in the 30s and 40s? Is that being taught? The Underground Railroad becomes a way of seeing how scientific racism has been warped and been used for so much ill for the last 150 years. And so, for a lot of kids, it's the first time knowing about Jim Crow. They've heard of segregation. They'll know that about laws for like bumptious contact, where it's illegal to so let a white person cross your path and you can be fined for not getting out of a white person's way. There's so many ways Jim Crow laws were constricted Black life in big ways. We couldn't vote, and also tiny ways, like it's illegal to quit your job, if you were and that not necessarily taught very thoroughly or taught very well. And so Nickel Boys, Underground Railroad becomes a way to talk about these different moments in history. So I'm very glad. And again, the kids who ask questions are wrestling with the book, and they're very intelligent. And so it's been, I sit here in my office, surrounded by like takeout containers and garbage and my broken dreams. And then 2 years later, it's out. The book's out in the world, and real life humans are reading it. So it's always lovely to see high school kids, but any audience. And it's been sort of difficult about this pandemic time is not being out there to see folks in person.
I think we have time for one more. A lot of people want to know what you're reading now.
Oh yeah. So I can work. With the pandemic, election, all I can read is like research for work.
Yeah.
And so a lot of books about New York in the 60s and now New York in the 70s. I'm working on something about New York in the 70s. In the last couple years, before I got so distracted by State of the World, Richard Powers' Overstory. I was reading him for many years, and I missed a couple novels and came back to the Overstory, and it's just like such a beautiful book and so inspiring to see someone you admire keep writing for decades and decades. Here's a novel coming out next fall, so that's really exciting. Nickel Boys is very compact, so I was reading a lot of novellas and short novels. I would like to give a shout out to Julie Otsuka and Mohsin Hamid. Mohsin Hamid, Exit West, Julio Tsuka, The Buddha in the Attic. Two just really great writers of short novels. Very instructive for me as like from a craft point of view. What do you leave in? What do you take out when you write a novel, a short novel? And also just pure pleasure of seeing, writers sort of hit it out of the park.
It's good when they hit it out of the park, and I think it's safe to say that you did it with the Nickel Boys. I think our time together tonight is up. I want to thank you for coming down virtually to Arkansas.
Virtually, yes.
Thanks to Crystal Bridges and thanks to Moira for getting us together. Thank you so much, Colson. Take care of yourself in this pandemic, and anybody else who wants to join the post chat, the link is in the Zoom.
Thanks a lot, guys. Stay safe. See you on the other side.